So, and maybe one other historical example we could touch on, which you wrote about, which I found fascinating, was you also compared some of what happened at the UK Labour Party in the 70s with the sort of conditions for Thatcher, with also what happened with the conditions for Trump. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. What distinguishes the Labour Party, of course, is that they were a nominally socialist party, and Labour is in the name. They're supposed to represent Labour. And so what happens in the 70s is that when they are in power, they have to run the capitalist state, and they have to run a capitalist state that is in crisis, that is dealing with conditions of economic crisis, and thus they have to be the ones to transfer the costs of the crisis onto the backs of labor to restore favorable business conditions. And Stuart Hall said, look, this is one of the contradictions of social democracy, and this is why, a Labour Party, a party which is claiming some kind of socialist values and claiming to represent labor, is never going to be as good at managing the capitalist state as an openly right-wing neoliberal kind of party. And the thing that Thatcher achieved was that she took this situation in which there was a crisis of social democracy, there was a crisis of hegemony in the society, and she created a new strategy, which Hall called authoritarian populism. And the remarkable thing about it was that she took these sort of academic principles of Austrian liberalism, of Hayek and von Mises and so on, about entrepreneurship and the individual liberty and so on, and she tied that together to these kinds of traditionalist values of family and nation. And that kind of tying together of those two things was the way that she was able to intervene and take the place of social democracy and really lead the restructuring of the society and the shift of the entire political discourse to the right, which you could see later on with New Labour and Tony Blair. Tony Blair basically is following in the tradition of Thatcher. Now, in the U.S., Reagan was the equivalent of this, coming a little after Thatcher. And in some ways, I think you can also see a kind of similar pattern in someone like Bill Clinton, who is the one we got NAFTA from, welfare reform, crime bill, and so on. He really was following in the tradition of Reagan.
Yep.
And so we have a similar thing here.
Yeah, Third Way sort of set the context, or Reagan and Thatcher set the context that Third Way politics sort of played in. What would be, I have a few sort of I have a slight, I don't know if there may be points of clarification, but what would be an example of sort of reclaiming this tradition properly in our context? You talk about something, insurgent universality, as one example. What does that look like? And especially in a way, I think that's, for purposes of shows like this and conversations like this, that can sort of get us to try to sort of transcend this really stale, dumbed-down debate that sort of evolved. Hysterically, even for people who kind of want a radical mantle, a lot of, there's substance that needs to be hashed out here, and we'll get to that in a second. But a lot of this sort of, I think, false tension actually does go back to a Clinton 2016 primary strategy. And let's not play in that field either, because it was a toxic and disingenuous one.
Yeah, and I think, I think we are susceptible to these kinds of toxic dynamics and interactions when we feel powerless. And we feel powerless when we don't have organizations, and when we don't have mass movements. And so the most important thing, we can have a back and forth about what identity politics means, what race and class, what the relation, et cetera, all day. But the important thing is to start taking those steps to making mass movements and organizations possible. And I think that one thing that is extremely counterproductive to that end is social media, where people think that they can hash out debates and have political discussions, but that becomes an endless self-perpetuating cycle. And that can even happen in political meetings. I've been in meetings that have lasted for hours in which some kind of minute question was debated and never resolved.
Right.
But the thing is, when people actually work on concrete projects and they actually achieve things and have to learn how to communicate with each other, then you get a kind of change in the way they relate to each other. Then you can then people are educated. You want to talk about how white people can be educated about racism. Well, they should be involved in concrete, practical projects that are anti-racist, working together with people of color, and that will educate them. Just going back and forth in a meeting is not going to educate anybody, and it's not going to accomplish anything.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with that more. And I wonder, though, because you see some of these tendencies now that are cropping up, in places that are very promising places, but places like DSA where it's almost like, and granted, I want to sort of emphasize that there's a lot of very good work being done. There's a lot of opportunity, but there are these sort of like, it's not only that what you're talking about isn't happening at times, it's actually getting undermined for the specific purposes of, for lack of a better term, call-out culture or endless group processing or, disingenuous attacks on people that really do seem to have more to do with sort of micro power dynamics. Just the type of stuff, and maybe we might make a comedy sketch out of this, but like the type of stuff that if it was applied to like an ANC cell meeting in like the 60s, like this, like Mandela never would have been able to create like, anything like they wouldn't have been able to deploy out of South Africa as an example, because somebody would have had an objection in the meeting notes, right? That there does seem to be some culture here that I think almost is, I don't know, maybe it really is in some ways laid at the fault of social media or people confusing their own sort of, personal grievances with politics or something. But it does seem to get kind of deeper of like, how do we get actually out of that towards the type of interactions you're talking about? Do you think it is as simple, or not as simple, but really getting out of a social media loop is key to that? Like, what do you think the answer to that is?
I do think that's key. It's necessary, but not sufficient. What else that involves? Look, the DSA, we can basically consider the DSA a new organization. It's basically like it doesn't resemble what it was before. The influx of new members is something that nobody was prepared for.
Right.
And I don't know what the future will be. I think there has to be, once again, the kinds of disputes you're talking about are based on false oppositions and false binaries, right. And frequently they are based on a failure to understand what it is to do politics, because doing politics, it involves making coalitions, right. Making compromises. It involves focusing on certain activities that have tactical relevance at a given point in time at the expense of others, or it involves having a decentralized kind of operation in which some people are doing other things that may not correspond to what you're doing. All of these are possibilities. They have to be part of strategic and organizational discussions. They shouldn't be part of either moral discussions or like completely abstract discussions about what is the meaning of socialism. Is right. The meaning of socialism Medicare for all or brake lights programs. I mean, the question is wrong from the start.
I'm actually holding my position pretty strongly on gulags, but you and I could fight about that later on Twitter.